Good morning, brothers. Today we're going to speak about the Spanish Golden Century. We're going to begin speaking about the early beginnings that even predate the Spanish Golden Century, and then we're going to delve completely into the Spanish Renaissance, and eventually we're going to continue, and hopefully we'll have enough time to cover at least part of the early 1600s, and that is what comprehends the Spanish Golden Century. We're going to speak first about the Spanish Renaissance, highlighting a key figure not only in the Spanish Renaissance but in world literature, who is St. John of the Cross. After that, I'm gonna try to give some insights into some of the most representative figures of the Spanish Golden Century. Nonetheless, it's not gonna be enough. So I do recommend, meaning enough to honor these great proponents of the Spanish Golden Century. And I definitely recommend you to resort to some encyclopedia to get to know better the lives of these great writers. And a great resource that has been also very helpful for me is the Biblioteca Virtual Cervantes. In the Biblioteca Virtual Cervantes, you can find a wide range of academic articles, and they are also very well centered, very specific, very narrow. So, for example, you can find an article there about the Spanish Golden Century, or an article about the formation and the background behind St. John of the Cross, and so on. And for these lectures, I have borrowed a lot from the Biblioteca Virtual Cervantes, and before we delve completely into the subject of this presentation, I just wanted to mention something that will help you understand better why I am presenting this in this way. Maybe you know the autobiography of Fulton Sheen. It's called Treasure in Clay. In that autobiography, he recalls how after he completed his first course as a professor, a senior professor told him, "Tear up your notes." And he explained, of course that seemed bizarre, but he explained to him, if you don't tear up your notes, meaning your teaching notes, you are going to end up repeating yourself year after year, and you are not going to be updated, and then you are going to grow stale. So he followed his advice, and year after year, he tore up his notes, always at the end of the semester. Okay, yesterday, when I was recording this presentation, I tore up my notes. And what was my surprise when in the afternoon, Father Patrick texted, "The recording didn't work." So under a little bit of pressure, I went to new sources. Intentionally, I didn't want to resort to the same sources I had used to prepare yesterday's lecture. So I resorted to new sources to renew the material of that lecture that will never be seen. And I am happy because I think that gave me the opportunity to deepen more into the contents of this lecture. Nonetheless, I beg you to be indulgent if sometimes I stumble off or something doesn't come in the precise order, but at least as far as it has to do with the contents, I'm happy about the contents I have here to share with you. We had already spoken about Garcilaso de la Vega and how he, along with some other poets like Juan de Boscan and Diego Hurtado de Mendoza, great figures of the Spanish Renaissance, bring in that great legacy that was already vibrant in Italy. And with them, we find the Italian metrics introduced into the Spanish language and therefore into Spanish poetry. And if Garcilaso de la Vega created the lira as a metrical pattern, as a properly speaking, a metrical pattern that belongs to Spanish poetry. And the lira, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, is called so because that's the beginning of the first line of his poem composed with that metrical pattern. Si de mi baja lira tanto pudiese el son que en un momento aplacase la ira del animoso viento y la furia del mar y el movimiento, and so on. It's 7-11, 7-7-11 with the rhyming pattern A, B, A, B, B. And you are going to see that in any composition that is credited to be a lira. And although Garcilaso de la Vega is the one who created this metrical pattern, it was a brother Luis of Leon, and eventually all the more St. John of the Cross, who took it to its highest achievements. Let me begin now with brother Luis of Leon, Fray Luis de Leon. He's indispensable to understand the Spanish Renaissance, and he borrows a lot from Italy. Not only in the metrical patterns that we have already spoken of, but he also borrows a lot from the Italian themes. Although his production is massive, it can be well categorized in two main periods. The first period is before his imprisonment, and the second period is after his imprisonment. In the first period, we find in him longing for quietude, peace, rest, and some melancholic tones. That's what we find in the first period before he was imprisoned. After he was imprisoned, we only find how this same longing and this melancholy intensify. So the first period is a period of search for quietude, search for rest, search for peace, and some kind of melancholy. In the second period, we find an intense search for quietude, an intense search for peace, and so on. Why was he imprisoned? Of course, you might be asking yourselves, and that was precisely because of some conflicts he had with the Spanish Inquisition. His imprisonment lasted for over 12 years, and after he came out of prison and came back to teaching, because he was an Augustinian friar, but he was also a professor. He was a professor of sacred scripture in one of the courses of theology in Salamanca, Spain. And allegedly, the Inquisition found some errors in the notes his students had taken from his lectures. He only defended himself, saying that he was not responsible for what his students wrote during his lectures, but that was not enough, and he was condemned to be imprisoned for 12 years. After he came back from his imprisonment, he came back to teaching, and he began with that great sentence, decíamos ayer, as we were saying yesterday. As a great example of that longing for peace and quietude, we find not a copy-paste from Horace's Beatus Ille, but a very strong inspiration from that Beatus Ille. If you remember Horace, you might remember that he wrote this Beatus Ille qui procul negotiis ut prisca gens mortalium paterna rura bovus exercet suis solutus omni fenore, and so on. So it's a very peaceful poem, which, by the way, is a satire, and you have to wait only until the final line to realize that it is a satire, that he's mocking that peace and that quietude. But in itself, it's a great poem that evokes peace and quietude. And Brother Luis of Leon takes that same poem and fits it into a Spanish metrical pattern like the lira. Qué descansada vida la del que huye del mundanal ruido y sigue la escondida senda por donde han ido los pocos sabios que en el mundo han sido. In Brother Luis of Leon, we do not find that irony or that satiric tone that Horace had, so he just continues through the, I think it's something like around 18 or 19 stanzas. So he just continues praising the peace and the quietude of living away and secluded from the turmoil and the worldly affairs. Just to bring in an English translation, how tranquil is the life of him who, shunning the vain world's uproar, may follow free from strife the hidden path of yore, chosen by the few who conned the true wisdom's lore. Now I'm going to start speaking about St. John of the Cross. But there's a connection, or at least there might be, because we know for sure that St. John of the Cross studied theology in Salamanca. And it's possible that Brother Luis of Leon was his professor. So St. John of the Cross might have been a disciple of Brother Luis of Leon. That is not entirely certain because there were at least 2 tracks and maybe more. So it's possible that St. John of the Cross did study theology but under some other professor. But at the same time, it's not disparaged. It's actually quite plausible to sustain that St. John of the Cross was a pupil of Brother Luis of Leon. St. John of the Cross was born in 1542. Born like Juan de Yepes. His father's name was Álvaro de Yepes. His mother's name was Catalina Álvarez. So he was Juan de Yepes y Álvarez. And he was born in Fontiveros. Fontiveros, a small town close to Avila. Let me just go a little back before the birth of St. John of the Cross, because he was the third of 3 brothers. So he was preceded by Luis, and he was also preceded by Francisco, his oldest brother. His father, Gonzalo Yepes, belonged to a noble and wealthy family. And he fell madly in love with Catalina Álvarez, but his family didn't approve of this marriage. He disregarded his family's objections and he married Catalina Álvarez, and as a result, his family disowned him. So he saw himself enduring some kind of financial hardship, and he ended up working along with his wife producing fabrics. As I already mentioned, they had 3 children, Francisco, Luis, and St. John of the Cross. And when John was 3, his father died, which only intensified the hardships and the financial struggles that the family was facing. It only took like 2 or 3 more years for the second brother to die. Luis died, and most likely he died from malnutrition, to the point that his mother said it is not a disease or anything that has brought you to the grave, but it is our poverty, it is our financial struggle that has caused your death. And that was a very sad instance and a very sad time, of course, and we don't know to what extent John of the Cross was aware of all that was happening, but I think that he was a very sensitive soul, so of course he felt all those things, and although he was still very young. He must have been in his something like 7 years old, or a little more, a little less. With a lot of humiliation upon herself, Catalina, his mother, resorted to Gonzalo's family, his late husband's family, asking them to at least help her support one of the children. Some of them declined, some of them accepted and received Francisco, and they even adopted him. But when she came back, she realized that they were vexing, that they were maltreating the child, and that he was not well fed. So although it supposed an economic burden, she took Francisco back with the family, and they had to move from Fontiveros to Arévalo, hoping to improve their financial situation. Eventually they moved to one of the most thriving cities and commercial cities in Spain, which was Medina del Campo. And in Medina del Campo, they tried to make a living again by producing fabrics. And it was then when St. John of the Cross started his education, and in exchange he had to offer something, so he served as an altar boy. And then he pursued his education with the Jesuits, from whom he learned especially Latin, humanities, and Spanish poetry. In 1563 he joined the Carmelites as Brother John of St. Matthias, Juan de Santo Matia. And it's well known how he encountered Teresa of Avila, who by the way was not a complete stranger to him, because at that time the life of Saint Teresa of Avila, the autobiography, had already been published. And St. John of the Cross read this autobiography and was very impressed. Maybe you already know that he was not satisfied with the Carmelite way of life, and he was considering become a Carthusian. But Saint Teresa of Avila deterred him from doing so, and she asked him to join him with the Reformed Carmelites. Was he the first? That's a good question. Yeah, he started the masculine branch of the Reformed Carmelites, because Saint Teresa of Avila had already started the Reformed Carmelites in the female branch with at least the first convent of San Jose in Avila, and maybe at that time they had already founded Medina del Campo, which is the second of their foundations. So they had already started founding new convents for nuns, but the masculine branch had not started, and she wanted to have some help to start the Reformed Carmelites with the masculine branch. And why am I questioning if St. John of the Cross was the first? Because along with him came Antonio de Heredia, Brother Antonio de Heredia. And with her wit and with her sense of humor, St. Teresa of Avila said, "Now I have 1 friar and a half." Maybe she says she had 1 friar and a half because St. John of the Cross was scarcely 4 feet tall. So being so short, it seemed like she had 1 friar and a half, and maybe that half friar was St. John of the Cross. In any case, that brought resistance, opposition, and even an imprisonment. The first imprisonment was, let's say, long-lasting, because the papal nuncio intervened under penalty of excommunication upon the Carmelite friars that had held St. John of the Cross prisoner, to release him. And he was released, but eventually he would be imprisoned again, and that imprisonment in Toledo would last for around 8 months. And it's not only to be held captive, but also to be excruciated with some bodily torments. And it is then, by the way, when he wrote the spiritual canticle. So when you read the spiritual canticle, don't think that he was in some kind of idyllic state. He was under a lot of pressure and under a lot of pain, under a lot of suffering, and he escaped. It almost looks like a thriller, but he managed to escape from his imprisonment, and the rest of his life he spent it in the south of Spain, covering positions of government for the Reformed Carmelites, covering positions of government, traveling also, preaching, helping out with the spiritual direction of nuns. And he was not that old. I think it was the year 1591. I'm almost sure it was 1591. If not, it was 1 year after 1592. But let's say it was 1591 when he died after a long disease that maybe some biographer will know what kind of disease that was. I don't know for sure, but it might have been some kind of bone cancer. That, of course, you can imagine it must have been very, very painful for him. Why am I saying it might have been bone cancer? Because biographers of his time say that the disease had already taken his bones. There are many misconceptions about St. John of the Cross. Some have presented the romanticized version of St. John of the Cross, and in spite of the imagery he uses, anybody who has read accurately the works of St. John of the Cross, he knows that imagery is merely spiritual. There's nothing sensual in it to begin with. Another misconception about St. John of the Cross is to present him as someone who lived a gloomy life and who lived depressed and surrounded and shrouded by melancholy. Again, that is not true. I have already stated how even in his imprisonment he could write so vivid verses like the spiritual canticle, and in him we find an intense sensitivity, someone who knew how to enjoy life, someone who knew how to enjoy beauty, to begin with the beauty of creation, nature. For example, when he was in Segovia, he had close access to orchards, gardens, fountains, oases, and that imagery touches him vividly. Or when he was in Duruelo, it's a short period of seclusion, where shortly after he had started the Reformed Carmelites, and in Duruelo there's a fountain, which by the way I've seen myself, and that inspired him precisely the verses of the fountain, the poem of the fountain. So he's someone who knew how to rejoice in creation. He was not someone who was depressed or mournful or all the time to begin with, and especially he knew how to find his delight in God himself. So if he knew how to find joy in creation, much more he knew how to find joy in the Creator. Another and final misconception about St. John of the Cross, there could be a few more, but I want to focus on at least on these 3 misconceptions about St. John of the Cross and correct them. Some have presented St. John of the Cross as a person who lived constantly fleeing from everything and fleeing from everyone. Like he fled from the Jesuits to begin with, then he fled from the Carmelites, then he fled from the university and the academic world, and eventually or ultimately he ended up fleeing from the world itself. He did not continue his formation with the Jesuits, okay, granted, but whatever he received from the Jesuits he took with him. He took with him his humanistic formation, he took with him his Latin, and he took with him that formation in Spanish poetry. He considered leaving the Carmelites and becoming a Carthusian, okay, granted, but he considered it. And then he became the reformer of the Carmelites. So he did not quit, he did not flee, he did not abandon. So it's a common misconception, but it's widely spread. But definitely he's not someone who was continually fleeing. The university, he did not pursue an academic career, okay, but again, he had a very, very solid academic formation. Let me just give you a few instances. To begin with, in his works, especially in his prose, we find a very accurate Aristotelian logic to begin with. Actually, he did not intend to write a critical edition or a philosophical treatise, but the quotes he brings in from Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas are rather accurate. There's also a strong influence of the scholastic philosophy and theology, and you can see that when you read the explanations of his own works and in his letters. There's also a strong influence of the Bible, which he knew very well, especially the Song of Songs. And above all, consider this. He was the rector of the Carmelite College in Alcalá de Henares. Alcalá de Henares at the time was the most important academic city in Spain, second only to Salamanca. So if he was the rector of the Carmelite College, he did need some profound academic formation to begin with. And then that same scheme was replicated in Baeza. He was also the rector of the Carmelite College in Baeza. Finally, some who present St. John of the Cross like constantly fleeing even from the world. Yes, he spent some time in Duruelo, but that was not excessive. Actually, he spent 13 years in Medina del Campo, which, as I have already stated, was teeming with commerce in that time. So definitely, he was not fleeing from the world. On the contrary, he was very, very well versed in the matters that pertain to the world, and he spent 13 years going from Medina del Campo to 13 years in Medina del Campo and over 20 years in some other cities in Spain, meaning moving from one city to another, traveling, covering positions of government, preaching, and I've already mentioned the spiritual direction. So definitely, even if he spent some time in Duruelo, apart from the world, in some kind of retirement, in some kind of retreat, that was definitely not excessive, and we cannot envision St. John of the Cross as someone who lived constantly fleeing from everything and from everyone. Let's come now to his influences. Of course, we have the Bible. We have especially the Canticle of Canticles. Something else that might be understated or unnoticed is the mudéjar art. As you know, there was presence of Islam in the Spanish Peninsula for around 8 centuries, and at the time of St. John of the Cross, that was still there, even if the Kingdom of Granada had already fallen. Nonetheless, the influence of their art was still there. And some have suggested, I don't know this for sure, but it's not entirely disparaged, that he not only appreciated the art, meaning architecture, for example, that can be sober, but he also appreciated the Sufi mystic poems of some poets of Islam who describe their own Sufi experiences through poetry. So I found that interesting, and I don't find it disparaged, and it might very well be true. I don't know it for sure though. Okay. Then again, this is something that we cannot know for sure, but most of scholars agree that he read The Cloud of Unknowing, that great book of the English anonymous author. And although we do not have any hard evidence to sustain that he read it, because we don't know which English translation of the text from English into Spanish he had access to, if any. Nonetheless, the imagery and some of the sentences are so similar that most of scholars agree that definitely he had read The Cloud of Unknowing. We also find the influence of Italian poetry, as I have already mentioned, that Italian poetry that was received within Spanish poetry and those metrical patterns, which creates some elegant and refined and cultured poetry. He knows that, and his poetry is very refined. But on the other hand, he also brings in that popular poetry, that which was common for the average people that didn't have high degree of education. They could also access to that popular poetry, and he brings in that as well. And in all of that, you can see how he refines it, he distills it, and he brings out the greatest pieces of literature that the world has ever seen. He takes all those styles, he borrows those traditions, but at the same time he refines them, he purifies them, he brings them together. And if you have read Fire Within by Thomas Dubay, he asks himself, without giving a definitive answer, but he asks himself if the poetry of St. John of the Cross came all together as a burst of inspiration, a very profound and intense inspiration that ended up being penned in such a masterful way, or if that is the result of some poems that St. John of the Cross wrote at first, and then he polished and cleaned up and refined and perfected throughout the course of years. We don't know. We know, for example, of Virgil that he did that. We know that he wrote a bunch of low quality verses that then he dedicated months on end to refine. So that's the way Virgil wrote. If the poetry of St. John of the Cross flowed smoothly and it flowed all in a burst of inspiration, or if it was a poetry that he refined over the course of years and years, we don't know, but that's an open question. But the result is undeniable. There we find a poetry that flows smoothly like the waters from a primeval spring, and they flow very naturally, which doesn't mean that it is something empty. On the contrary, in the poetry of St. John of the Cross, you do not find a single idle word. There's not a single idle word. And for example, when you read Homer, you find that some of his epithets, okay, yes, they are accurate, but at the same time, you see that those epithets are there to fill the gap, because he needed a long syllable and two short syllables. So that was also, since it was an oral tradition, that helped them remember well, right? So that's the case with the Homeric epithets. And you can see in many poets, even great poets, that they do insert this word here because they needed to fill the line or because they needed to rhyme. Okay, and that has been criticized also through the history of literature, especially by those who don't like rhyming patterns or do not like metrical patterns. But in St. John of the Cross, we do not find that at all. Not at all. There's not a single idle word in St. John of the Cross. And just let me give you this example. In the spiritual canticle, I think it's line 20 or 21, somewhere around that part. A las aves ligeras, leones, ciervos, gamos saltadores, montes, valles, riberas, aguas, aires, ardores, y miedos de la noche veladores. Por las amenas liras y canto de sirenas os conjuro que cesen vuestras iras y no toquéis el muro porque la esposa duerma más seguro. Let me just give you an English translation. Swift-winged birds, lions, stags, and leaping roes, mountains, lowlands, and river banks, waters, winds, and ardors, watching fears of night, by the pleasant lyres, and the siren's song, I conjure you, to cease your anger, and not touch the wall, that the bride may sleep in deeper peace. It's portentous, right? There's a lot of imagery, but you would say, well, what's the sense of each one of those images? Well, they are very well justified. And actually, he did not write one, he wrote two explanations to the spiritual canticle, and it's impressive to see how he explains literally word by word why he is inserting that word, and he's justifying it very often with quotes from scripture or with quotes from scholastic philosophy. So each word, each image is there for a particular reason. And let me just read you something. I'm not going to read the whole explanation of these stanzas, but in this, I'm reading the spiritual canticle, the explanation he gives to the spiritual canticle. Okay, in these two stanzas, the bridegroom, the Son of God, gives the bride soul possession of peace and tranquility by conforming the lower part of the lower part to the higher, cleansing it from all its imperfections, bringing under rational control the natural faculties and motives, and quieting all the other appetites. Okay, so this is what is happening on a broader scale. And then I skip a few lines and I go to paragraph 6, where he's going to explain what the lions are. By the lions, I refer to the acrimony and impetuosity of the irascible power, for in its acts this power is bold and daring like the lion. And then he continues explaining what he means with the stags and the leaping roes, and why are they two different images, each one of them referring to something else, and why we have stags and we have leaping roes. Why are they leaping? By the stags and the leaping roes, he refers to that other power, the concupiscible, which is an appetitive power. This faculty causes two classes of effects, one of cowardice and the other one of daring. It produces the effects of cowardice when things are found difficult, for it then retires, withdraws within itself, and becomes cowardly. And you can read any line of the spiritual canticle and then go to the explanation, actually the explanations he gives of those lines, and you're going to see that there is not a single idle word in the poetry of St. John of the Cross. Okay, I still have a few minutes, and before I finish, I will not say I have spoken sufficiently about St. John of the Cross, because I don't think that can be done. I don't think anybody can speak sufficiently or enough about St. John of the Cross. But moving on, of course, there are great figures of the Spanish Golden Century, of the Spanish Renaissance. And now let me just present a few of these great figures of the Spanish Baroque. That fits completely within the Spanish Golden Century. After the break, we are going to see Cervantes. So now let's focus on Lopez Vega, Quevedo, and Góngora. In Lopez Vega, we find someone that should remind us of Ovid, because they were very, very talented. And they have so much talent to the point where they squander it. So in Lopez Vega, we find a massive bulk of production, maybe more than 400 theater plays, That doesn't mean he composed all of them, but since copyright in those times was not as it is in our days, maybe instead of plagiarizing his work, they wrote plays that then they credited to Lopez Vega, because whatever Lopez Vega wrote was going to sell well. Lopez Vega was born in 1562 and he died in 1635, and he did not have an exemplary life. Although he did come through periods of penance and conversion, those periods of penance and conversion were also fragile and short-lasting. At the end of his life, he embraced the priestly state, and we don't, of course, there might have been some true repentance and some devotion, but at the same time, that was because he needed a pension. And even as a priest, he did not live an exemplary life. But at the end of his life, he dedicated himself to taking care of that woman he had lived with. And maybe this will help you understand the repentance and the longing and the poems he writes, especially his sacred rhymes and his sonnets. Mañana le abriremos, respondía, para lo mismo responder mañana. Maybe this will resonate a lot more now that you know this about his life. And he had a great friend who was Francisco de Quevedo y Villegas. Francisco de Quevedo y Villegas, if you do a quick Google search, you will be surprised to see that first and foremost, he's not a literary figure. He's a politician and maybe a thinker, because his great passion was philosophy and philology. And of course, you can see a lot of philosophical intent in his poetry. But let us focus now on his poetry. In López de Vega, in Francisco de Quevedo, in Luis de Góngora y Argote, and many others, we find a reflection about the decline of Spanish affairs, Spanish social life, Spanish economics. Ultimately, it was the decline of the Spanish Empire. And that splendor that had been known in the 1500s now is dwindling. And that makes a lot of people reflect. For example, López de Vega wrote that poem of Pobre barquilla mía, entre peñascos rota, sin velas desvelada, y entre las olas sola. He compares the Spanish Empire to a boat that is dragged by the winds and by the waves. And if you remember Horace and if you remember Alcæus, you will realize that he's drawing inspiration from them, because first Alcæus had written a poem about the ship of the state, meaning comparing the political situation of his time with a ship in a storm. Then Horace borrows that same idea and applies it to his situation and to his context with Roman and with the Latin metrical patterns. And then López de Vega would do the same. With Francisco de Quevedo, we find that great poem about Mire los muros de la patria mía. It's a reflection about his own fatherland, and he looks at the walls of his fatherland that are in decay. What does this mean? That's a very interesting poem because it zooms in and it gives you also a sense of how things are shrinking. First he starts speaking about the fatherland, then the fields, then his house, and even if inside his house he ends up locked and he realizes how everything has lost its luster and its strength, its power and its splendor. Francisco de Quevedo y Villegas is the chief leading figure of a movement that flourished during the Spanish Golden Century. This movement is called Conceptism. The Conceptist movement tries to condense as much meaning in the shortest amount of extension. I want to say as much as I can in very, very few words. So for that reason they use ellipses, meaning not repeating things or drawing out words. They use ellipses, they use paradoxes, and it makes it a little unclear, or maybe very unclear. His archenemy, whom he met in Valladolid, was Luis de Góngora. Luis de Góngora y Argote, who was born in 1561 and died in 1627, was his arch enemy, and he leads a movement that tried to do the exact opposite. They tried to make their poems stuffy and ornated and grandiloquent without minding the content. Or actually, if there was no content, it really didn't matter, because what really mattered to them was the form. And of course, it's also very obscure to read and very difficult to read, because they create words and they use a hyperbaton that no Spanish speaker back then or in our days would use. And it's a struggle to understand Luis de Góngora. But even if they were arch enemies, in the end, in spite of themselves, they are just two sides of the same coin. Because in the end, what they were trying to achieve was to detach themselves from popular poetry. Now poetry, and actually art in general, is not going to be for everyone. Only a very restrained elite is going to have access to poetry, and only a few learned scholars, a few persons who have that formation will be able to access poetry. So in the end, the conceptist movement and the Culturan movement, that's the name of the movement that was led by Luis de Góngora, they are the two sides of the same coin. They both try to detach themselves from the popular masses, and they try to make art as something exclusive, something that belongs only to an elite, and something that can be accessed only by a few. So, as I said, this is not enough, but I hope at least it can give you some introduction so you can further study the lives of these authors, and especially as you read their poems, so you understand what was behind this, what was their intent. Thank you very much.